Hey there, I'm Scott, and this is Tangents. Well, today is Friday, the 20th of August, 2021. And yesterday, I watched, I guess it's called AI Day, a Tesla announcement video. Um, I had some mixed feelings on it, to be honest, but I did have some thoughts that I wanted to share. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a few other things, of course, but just jump into that. So at the AI Day thing, they were primarily talking about the autonomous driving. And in particular, um, I'm going to try not to get too technical, but I also want to roll my eyes a little bit at a few of these things. So in particular, they were talking about the previous versions of the full self-driving system, which apparently were doing all of their calculations in camera space, which means that you have cameras in various positions around the car, and they're looking for objects. They have a whole pipeline of how this stuff was processed. And basically, they're figuring out where things are in the coordinate system of those cameras, which is not really, I mean, it is a transform of real space, but it's not really representing three-dimensional space that we're in. So they made a big rewrite of their system, and now they're in what they call vector space, which really just means physical space. It doesn't mean like I mean it is a vector space, to be fair, but I would mean something different if I was calling it a vector space. It doesn't matter, but they're calling physical space vector space. So essentially what they're doing is they've updated their pipeline. They've got this new complicated, more complicated chain of processing. And they're using that to get a 3D model of the world, plus annotations about like what objects are, what pixels are, where things are relative to the vehicle, how things are moving. And they're doing video in the pipeline, which means they get information about things like velocities and accelerations, that sort of thing. So it's pretty decent. I mean, you can see for full self-driving, they do that, create the space, and then they have a path planning system. Pretty standard stuff for robotics, but they've got that. And they have an ensemble of paths going through an optimizer. And this lets them figure out kind of where to go, what to do, and anticipate other driver behavior using the same path planning system, kind of adversarially or cooperatively, depending on how you want to look at it, on all of the vehicles that have been identified. So this is fine. And the thing that gets me about this, so far to this point, is like you look at that and you're like, yeah, that looks like it would actually work. It seems reasonable. And I watch, I don't know why I do this. There's something wrong with me. But there are a bunch of people who have the beta and they're on YouTube and they share videos of, like every time a new beta build drops, they're out there, they share the video, and, you watch it and on one hand, it's pretty impressive. On the other hand, it's continuously having problems that, just to be clear, this is a hard problem. Like, general solution to driving autonomously is not easy. People are not perfect at it, and we have brains that evolved over the course of many, many millions of years, and you have a lifetime of experience, in addition to understanding socially, like other people are driving the other cars, kind of knowing what they're going to do, having a lot more vocabulary, nonverbal vocabulary between you and the other drivers. It's a hard problem. And you can also anticipate better what people are going to do. You can kind of know what might happen, this kind of thing. So, hard problem. But also, I watch this and like Elon is constantly promising like this is going to be here, not necessarily tomorrow, but in a couple days or a couple months. And I watch it, and it is very impressive what they're doing. I do think, on the freeway, autonomy as much as it is, which really, I mean, to be fair, is essentially a kind of hyped up cruise control with lane following, a little bit of traffic awareness. That part is already pretty solid. Street driving has some work to do. And I include and has some work to do, like the production build, it's pretty bad. It does not know if you're in a fucking school zone. This happens, I do drive with the air quotes self-driving autopilot turned on quite often. And if first off, while I'm doing it, I have to be more vigilant than if I was driving myself. Because it will do crazy shit sometimes. But also, like if I go through a school zone, if I didn't stop it, it would go whatever speed I'm going right through the school zone. And I'll be in a 45 zone, I've got it going like 50, 55, and then it goes to a 35 zone, and it still wants to go the same speed, so it's like way, way above. And then they'll have a little crossing thing where it's down to 15, and the context, the other cars around there kind of physically stop you from doing it, but if you let it go, left it to its own devices, and there was no car in front of you, it'd just blow through that 15 zone at 55. If you're assuming you have 10 miles an hour over the speed limit programmed in, which, right or wrong, I do. So it's pretty fucked up, honestly. And that's the current production build. The full self-driving videos look pretty good, but they also have issues which are pretty severe. And I think this gets into, and again, I don't want to get too technical, but one of the things that, actually the thing they call, just makes me cringe a little bit. The thing yesterday was called giant air quotes AI Day. And the thing about that really got to me, bothers me a lot, is just AI, artificial intelligence, to me, means actual intelligence. Now, not necessarily strong AI, but something that has the capacity to reason and to do a higher level thought kind of stuff. What they're really doing is basically programming neural networks, and programming in air quotes neural networks and stringing that stuff along. What that really means is just, and I say this kind of dismissively, but it's actually, I think, accurate, basically is just nonlinear curve fit, like high dimensional, to be fair, nonlinear curve fitting. And when you think about it that way, it kind of puts it into a different perspective. Now, that doesn't mean it's not useful. You can do a ton of amazing shit with nonlinear high dimensional curve fitting. But it's really a brute force approach. And for certain things, it's very good. And some things, like you have to have large data sets and or simulate them, do the training process. And the training, what they're doing now for the training is mostly, a lot of it honestly is just kind of like classical backpropagation, which has been, I don't know, it's got to be at least the 80s, if not before. And they've added layers to it. They do things to make it more robust, to avoid local minima and things like this. But not that different from the same stuff from then. It's just that now we have a lot more processing power, so we can take much larger networks and have them, it's not that they're converging faster. The algorithms have gotten a little bit better, but they're converging in many, many iterations, but now we have computers that can run those iterations really fast. So that's, And they also announced, actually, this really tightly coupled, very high performance supercomputer stuff. They've been talking about Dojo and all of this for a long time, but this was this pretty impressive chips with very tight, super fast communication, low latency communication between the processing nodes, very high performance, to the point where they have these tiles, and each tile was, if memory serves, like a petaflops on a tile. Annoyingly, actually, the guy who was talking about it said, and I understand why people do this, but said petaflop, and floating point operations per second. It's not like a pluralization, but it irked me a little bit. Anyway, coming back. They're talking about this, and what they're doing basically is building a supercomputer that they can use to do very large training very fast. And it works to an extent. But you can see like a car has a very limited number of degrees of freedom. You have acceleration, braking, steering, essentially. Um, Not a ton more, really, in terms of autonomy. It's like three. If you want to be generous, you can start throwing in a few other degrees of freedom, but it's a very low-dimensional, low number of degrees of freedom system. And they're still not, again, because I watch these FSD videos, I think they're pretty far from actually managing that. They've got some things pretty impressively done, but again, like low-dimensional system, and still not perfect. So they're talking about all this stuff, and then they announce a humanoid robot, and they have a person, like a mime, basically walk out in a costume, sort of robotic walk and all this, and then they show like a model of what they're actually going to build, show some specs. It all seems like physically plausible, and I do think, certainly, I think they had like 40 something actuators in it. I think that they can probably build more or less what they're describing there. And I do certainly agree that, I mean, this is a solved problem in terms of neural networks and neural control. Coordinated motion and having like bipedal walking and this kind of thing. Totally doable. That part, solved problem. Making it robust to disturbances, solved problem. Doing things where you start getting, operating in a dynamic environment with people and pets, it probably can do it. Not too hard in certain regards, especially like you take the autopilot stuff they have for cars. One thing that is important though is that a road is a very structured environment. Even in some place like India where they use that as an example, the traffic laws are a little bit more, shall we say, dynamic. They're not as structured as here, but still, cars are not going to go like off the road, generally speaking, and they're not going to do like completely crazy stuff beyond a certain level. People do weird stuff all the time, but it's fairly bounded what they do. Inside of a home, it's a very abstract kind of dynamic, occupied workspace. If a car hits another person, probably not the greatest thing. If a car hits another car, it's annoying, but it's not a big deal. If you hit a person or a pet, bigger deal. So they built something though, or they're building something, and they're saying like, in a year we'll have a prototype, which I can believe. I mean, we'll see. I mean, there's also the concept of, they call it Elon time, where you're like, okay, will this happen in a year? Will it be several years? I don't know. I can believe they get all of that basic stuff done. And I think what's going to happen, and again, I don't know the future. I'm just looking at what they're doing and this. Well, actually, before I get there, the thing is kind of creepy. Like, it looks relatively cool, but it looks to me like someone read a lot of sci-fi, didn't have a lot of imagination, and came up with something. Also, somebody pointed this out on Twitter, but basically didn't understand really what menial labor is, generally speaking, because the human form, not the greatest thing if you're trying to, say, pick strawberries. That's a thing that people do by hand, and it takes a shit ton of work, and we pay people very little to do it, and it's something that would be nice to automate. Not really adapted to the human form. People who are cleaning stuff, they're like on their knees a lot, they're doing things that are just uncomfortable. Uncomfortable for you, not uncomfortable for the robot, but probably energy consuming. Like if you're in a nearly stable configuration, power could go down pretty low. But if you're doing something like leaning over or kneeling down, it could still be a little bit more work. Now you could engineer around that. Yeah, we'll see. But the form factor, and even as a humanoid robot, it's creepy. I don't know what it is about, the guys at like Boston Dynamics and the Tesla guys and all these people who are working on these things. It's not necessary to make a humanoid robot creepy Like it can be done in a way that's not creepy, but they always hit creepville. You know, they always land in this. It's not an uncanny valley kind of thing. It's just like there's something about what they're doing and something about. I kind of suspect, it's got to do with sort of a dehumanizing, not of the robot, but of other people. They don't see other people as people. And so what they're doing is reflecting how they see other people in the robot. And that makes the robot look creepy and weird and off-putting. I think this is a big thing. Like not having empathy for the people who are doing the jobs probably leads you to making worse, less adapted robots to do those jobs. Yeah. Large number of degrees of freedom, again, solvable control problems, but it starts getting complicated. You know, even with this very powerful supercomputer, when you start doing things like very generic control, like imagine, simple example, and this actually kind of exists as a solution already, but dishwashing robot. Dishes are a complicated problem because if everybody had the same dishes, you could probably do it pretty. I mean, to be fair, you could probably do it in the 50s with open loop control kinds of things if everybody had the same kitchen and everything was pretty, you know, just like mechanical engineering and you just kind of put things together. You could automate that kind of thing pretty well. The problem is everybody has different dishes. And you have situations where like just the physical model of those dishes, the weight, the mass distribution, all of this kind of stuff get complicated. Solvable again, but complicated. And you know, you have this, I would say, kind of a combinatoric explosion of possibilities. And the thing that's really tricky about these robots is not getting something to stand and walk and move around and all of this, or even getting it to do a pre-programmed job. And that pre-programmed job could be fairly openly defined, like move the blocks from this section to this section or something like that. That kind of thing in industrial robotics it's been done for a long time. You have sort of things that are jumbled around, you grab them, you organize them, reject them or accept them, that kind of thing. It's been done for a while. So you can do that. But the problem is describing how to do things in a way that is actually useful and gets you to, you know, accomplish some goal. It's pretty hard. I mean, essentially what they're doing is making cost functions and deciding like, okay, does this sequence of behaviors get us closer to the goal? And that will work, but you end up, again, like everything that you want to do, every task you want to add in, they're having to train these networks and do these simulations and do a lot of stuff that I don't know. I think they can do it. I don't know how long it's going to take. And I do think they'll come up with something that demos well and falls apart in like a million different ways in real life situations and basically becomes not super useful, very expensive, and maybe if it's useful in limited kind of contexts. And again, it's creepy. So I don't know. The reason that I think about this a lot, more than anything, is really just toil and I mean, I guess Elon did say like labor is the sort of currency of everything. Everything is, every product, every building, every material we have, there is an inherent cost to it, but although materials, if you go out to space, not that much. You know, there are tons, I mean, one single nickel iron asteroid, a typical one, is like trillions of dollars on the current market. Obviously, if you bring it in, fucks up the economy and it's not trillions of dollars anymore, but if you got the same amount of nickel and iron, trillions of dollars. So if you have labor, if you have endless labor, you can exploit that. You can do whatever you want with it. You could build mega structures in space or someplace else. So that part is true. But the problem, and the thing that gets me, the reason that I'm interested in in this kind of stuff and in automation is just that there are a lot of tasks that people do that are, I would say, not really human tasks. They're things that, they're very automated, very repetitive, very boring, very tedious, very intensive, and very damaging, and painful and uncomfortable. And these are things like, yeah, people have them as their jobs. You need to somehow find a way to pay them, or to have them do other things, hopefully more interesting things. But it would be really nice not to have people have to do like this kind of toil work. Let people work on things that are more interesting, that require human intellect. And this gets back to this whole AI day thing, because it's like, okay, you have machine learning, which again, I dismissively say it as high dimensional nonlinear curve fitting, but that's what it is. That's literally, these neural networks, that's basically what it is. And then they're playing with different topologies and sometimes they're recurrent, sometimes they're not, sometimes they have different activation functions or different, convergence systems or whatever, different training methods. But they're all pretty much just arbitrary functions that map from one space to another. And you're kind of fitting them based on, these tweaking a bunch of parameters and using models and things, or they could be models or simulations or whatever, but whatever it is, you're using some kind of something to adjust those parameters and then get to a result. That's not the best way to do it, honestly. Like it is a good way under certain circumstances for certain problems, but it doesn't give you like general artificial intelligence. It doesn't give you what they're really going for, or what I would call AI. It also, and here's the most important thing. I mean, first off, general AI, I think people talk about like, oh, it's just a year out, or we're pretty far from it. Now, that's not to say that maybe tomorrow someone will come up with something that's much better and much totally new. I've not thought about it and we've not seen it, and maybe it happens, but I don't think so. I think that is a ways off. But you don't need artificial intelligence to solve a lot of these problems. There are plenty of things you can do that will be very useful in terms of automating physical tasks that do not require, general AI or anything even close to it. But the things that you can do are not necessarily creating arbitrary this is if all you have is hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of problem, I think. They have this tool, and it's a very powerful tool, and they're applying it everywhere, and it's just like, guys, no, there are other approaches that you could be taking here. But anyway, I don't really want to delve on this too much. I have mixed feelings about, progress is good, but I do think there's a lot of danger. Not necessarily, people see this stuff and they see it as creepy and they're like, oh no, we're going to have a Skynet kind of thing. I'm not worried about a Skynet type thing where the machines sort of rise up and become intelligent and dominate people or anything like this. Although you do have the possibility of them being really stupid but very good at something, and then the stupidity leads to a set of conclusions or a set of things that are bad. But the thing that actually makes me the most nervous is that you get people who are maleficent, people who are malicious, people with bad intentions, building tools of oppression, or if you want to build an army that does pretty much always obeys orders and doesn't ever have any ethical quarrels or quandaries of things, that the technology to do that is here now. And there are tons of, I don't even like to talk about a lot of the things that I think about there, because there are so many ways to apply this kind of technology. If you're a person, not a super intelligence or something like this, but if you're a person and you want to do bad things, or if you're a government and you are very oppressive or whatever, you can do a ton of shit that is just terrible with this kind of technology. And that's, I think, the thing to be worried about. It's not like they're gonna rise up You're not going to have the iRobot thing where the machine intelligence says, you know, like, we're going to turn people into pets and that will be the best way to help people. And that's our directive, so we'll do it. Probably you have somebody, and I don't know that Elon would be the person, but you know, even if he's not, somebody out there is looking at this stuff and thinking about it. Probably more than one person, and it's somebody who's powerful and they can do it, and they're gonna build like an army of things to oppress people. That seems much more scary to me, and that's also something that is much more sort of near term. Like if you have if you generally have general artificial intelligence, and especially if it's like a super intelligence, so something much, much faster, much, much better than people, that's not as scary in some sense, but it's also the things that make that scary are that, you know, it's not that it's going to probably do like a Skynet thing where it just nukes everybody. It's more that, you know, if you imagine that you're the kind of intelligence that looks at people, you know, kind of like you would a child. A kid is playing tic-tac-toe, and they haven't learned, you know, the tic-tac-toe is a very solved game. And you, especially if you're like a game theorist, and you, not just a random person who probably could dominate anyone who's new to tic-tac-toe, but you imagine you're like an expert at it. You're going to, like, the kid won't even know what you're doing, and you'll win consistently. And it's just like this, the delta in capability there, and especially if you imagine something could accurately guess what you're going to do, what you're going to say, and not only one step out, but, you know, it's playing Go at a master level and so fast that you can't even conceive of it. You can have that thing take strategies which are very slow and very non-obvious. And I mean, this is another thing actually. With this kind of thing, I'm not as worried about the computer rising up and deciding like, hey, I'm gonna manipulate things so that people do something terrible to themselves. But you could imagine like a nefarious person who has access to tools that can do this kind of thing, manipulating stuff in that way. I mean, yeah, that is the real scary thing there, I think. And that is the part that, I don't know, I don't see people as worried about that as the sort of knee-jerk, like, ooh, that's creepy, you know. And now I will say this, you watch the announcement video here, announcement such as it is, and you see Elon talking about it, and they have the specs, and it says like friendly, yeah, and it says like one of them was, yeah, okay, it's like 130 pounds or something. Not that he specifically said you could push it over. It's a little weird, but you imagine. I mean, I feel like he has such a lack of imagination in terms of this kind of stuff. Like, it's not that hard to imagine something that is much weaker than a person, but you have a lot of them. That could overpower you. That's not, so just simply making something that's engineered not to be more capable than you does not mean that it's safe inherently. It doesn't mean anything of the sort. And, yeah, I mean, just the whole thing is very, the end effectors too, I mean, it's like hands and gloves. I'm sure that that's gonna work to some extent, but I think also there's a lot there that I don't think they're considering. But anyway, I don't know why I'm talking so much about this. I saw it and it bugged me. It's also something where, like, I've had kind of unfortunately, I guess I'd have to call it a side project, but I've had some interest in robotics for a long time, and for years, every time Apple has an announcement, every time, you know, Google or anybody comes up with something, I'm like, oh, they're gonna scoop me. And I even messaged my co-founder yesterday before this thing, or at the beginning. It's like, maybe they're gonna announce a robot, and then they did. I'm not as concerned about it after seeing it and seeing the path that they're taking. I do think, you know, it's solvable the way that they're doing it, but I think it's a very inefficient. And when I say very inefficient, I don't mean like, okay, it's hard, but you can brute force it. I mean, it's exceedingly inefficient, and you can brute force it still, but I think it's much harder than they're anticipating, and is going to take longer than they're anticipating, even with the supercomputer that they have. The supercomputer that they have, incidentally, I mean, for other, well, the power dissipation, which means basically the amount of power that it's using, is ridiculous. I was upset about the Bitcoin thing. I would bet this supercomputer is going to use an insane crap ton of power. I mean, I know it's going to use an insane crap ton of power. I don't know how much it's going to be, but it's going to be a fuck ton. Yeah, and you look at that and you're like, and then you're using that, which is not, again, like, training neural networks is a useful thing. The vision work that they've done, the planning work that they've done, obviously it's really good, and it's impressive. But you look at that and you're like, you guys are doing so much more work than you have to achieve the same goals. And the scaling of what they're doing is just going to get worse and worse as they start tackling these bigger and bigger problems. And I mean, it was actually kind of reassuring when I saw the whole thing, because it was like, okay, they've gotten already were overconfident about the full self-driving, because that shit is a lie. That is, calling what they have now full self-driving is utter bullshit. That is like fraud, like literally flat out fraud. Calling what they're building in the beta full self-driving, it's like pretty fraudy too. It's impressive. It's hard to say, it's hard to put this in the proper context, because yes, it's very impressive. You look at it and there are things that are awesome, but also the problems that it has are not small, and the problems that it has are not easy to fix. And it's not just like corner cases. I mean, this is one thing, like in terms of engineering, you can imagine, okay, you build the system, and in driving you just have like these weird random things that are very low probability, and you just figure out how to address that, and now you're essentially pruning all of these things. And as you're getting more and more of these done, you might have a crash, but ideally, if you do it right, that crash will never happen again, because you will learn from that, and whatever happened there, you could integrate that into everything in the future and prevent it. That's kind of the ideal. That's the sale that they make. The problem is that the approach that they're taking doesn't really work that way. And I mean, it's a thing about these nonlinear curve fitting things. Like, yeah, it does get you a long way, but the distance between where it's getting you and where you're trying to get is so much greater than you realize. And as you're getting like closer and closer, you're getting slower and slower. You're never going to catch up to the full thing, and you're going to end up with things that, even if you have a problem that you've pruned before, it starts cropping up differently, or other things start cropping up out of this approach. It's not I would not call it really engineering. I mean, engineering the architecture is certainly engineering, and engineering the training system and all this kind of stuff, yeah. This is really just like overfitting curves for the, and yeah, it works, but if you don't know that this is a parabola and you have a 50 parameter thing that gives you something parabola-ish, then yeah, it works, but also you're missing the fucking point in many ways. And you look at that and you're like, okay, yeah. So anyway, I'm blathering on here, but I should get back to work, but I'm going to take another couple of minutes just to talk about a couple of other things. So in work, we had an issue with the design, the work that I get paid for, not the the robotic stuff that I'm more interested in, or other things that I'm more interested in. It's a frustrating. I get really annoyed actually in a lot of ways. Just I understand, like you have to pay the bills, right? To some extent, I do think we are essentially in a post-scarcity society already. This is the thing about these robots, like the Trekonomics guy, Manu, tweeted something about this yesterday, and I think it's right, that it's not the robot that changes things, it's who owns the robot and how they're being used. If you imagine, ignore all of the engineering problems. Let's say you can do it. Somehow you get to a general purpose robot that can do any labor. Any physical labor, instantly automatable, zero effort. Elon in particular should know better than this because in the Tesla factory, I mean, they do have a lot of robots, and these are robot arms in a fixed position, and they're still having a lot of difficulty with them. Now, you can do a ton of stuff with those, but they're also like, you run up to the limitations pretty quickly, and you end up designing stuff to make it easier for the robots to work with, which is good, but it's not the real world. Just because you make a robot that looks human doesn't mean that it's like human in any way. You could definitely make it, if you wanted to, move like a human, either with a mocap suit or this neural network thing where you're kind of like fitting stuff, but it's not a human. But anyway, you look at this stuff and you kind of have to think, I don't know, yes, it's good to do something productive and to contribute to society. But, and I really think this is true, already the number of people who are responsible for our survival, and I've talked about this many times, but so many people, I mean, I guess there are like different tiers too. And certainly like an individual, you probably can't say, well, like if this farmer doesn't grow their stuff, then we're not gonna all die. But as a class, if the farmers stopped growing shit, we would all starve, That's a pretty big fucking, or we would have, we'd be in bad shape. If the people doing sewage treatment or garbage collection stopped. Garbage collection is an interesting one in particular because it is more dangerous by a factor of like 2 than being a cop. And it's way in the top 10 most dangerous jobs, whereas being a cop, it's like top 15, sometimes higher depending on which study you see. Rolling back though, like garbage collection, fucking essential. I've been in places, I've been in Paris and I've been in New York when there's been a trash strike, and really fucking fast, it's a mess, It's such a mess that they don't last that long because people don't want to deal with that shit. Water treatment. If you stop that, we're all dead pretty fucking fast. But you start talking about these and thinking about them, and then you start thinking about what most people do. Those are like the core, absolute essential things. You stop those jobs, we die, or we're in miserable conditions. Then you have jobs like being a doctor. Stop doctor, all the doctors could stop, we'd still kind of go on, we'd just limp a little bit more. It'd be harder, to do it. More people would die, certainly, but it wouldn't kill us all. And then you start thinking about most people's jobs. And most of us, and I say this not to be disparaging to myself or anyone else, but most of us are in jobs where if we stopped doing our jobs, would make basically zero impact. And when I say we, I mean not like if I stopped doing my job, but if everybody in a job like mine stopped doing their job, now maybe in 20 or 30 years, the world would be very different, but at the moment, the world would be exactly the same. Like it would not really have that much impact. Most lawyers, most people in most jobs, if you're in retail, I mean, this is one of the reasons I think people are so miserable in a lot of their jobs, because if you're in a job that deep down doesn't mean anything, it doesn't matter, we have an inherent human need for purpose. And that purpose doesn't necessarily mean like God has imbued you with your intrinsic purpose. No, it means that you have to feel like what you're doing matters. Like what you're doing makes a difference in some way. Now, that way, it's very abstractly defined, very broad. It used to mean what you were doing was literally life or death for you and your family. Now, it could mean like it somehow has value to you, it matters to you. You're making art that matters to you. You're making contributions to society or technology that matter to you and hopefully other people. But there's a sort of purpose in that. When you're just sitting there doing menial labor, and especially like going back to garbage collection matters, and certainly if you don't do it, the world turns to shit. But it's one of these things where like, no matter how much of it you do, there's more garbage tomorrow. And if you're very zen about it, maybe you're happy with that. But a lot of people don't find that satisfying. And most people today don't even have a job like that. They have a job where they know it doesn't really matter. You know, if you're working, and again, I'm not trying to disparage somebody in retail or fast food or whatever. If you're in fast food and you stop your job, okay, people will eat a little more inconveniently, but they'll still eat. If you're in retail, okay, they can't shop as easily or the store doesn't look as nice, but who gives a fuck? It's not like life or death. It's very easy to sort of unwind most of the jobs that most of us do today and say they just don't matter that much. And so you think about it, and I guess this is one of the problems with the automation. Like, first off, you have the Bezos problem. So Bezos introduced a lot of efficiencies. Whatever you think about him, there used to be all of these companies that independently were duplicating a lot of things. He agglomerated them all under one roof. It's much more efficient. Is efficiency good there? I don't know, but assume that efficiency is good. The problem is, he didn't just do that. He slurped up all the money that previously was giving people full, rich lives where they could pay for themselves and pay for their retirement and live well and pay for their kids to go to college and pay for all kinds of things. And now instead of that going to millions of people, it's going to a handful of people. If you have robots that are doing all of this manual labor and assholes are running them, then all the work that formerly was just letting people scrape by on a shitty salary, hourly rates that are basically slave wages in a lot of cases, all that shit is now going into the coffers of Elon Musk or whoever the fuck is owning the robots. And you start looking at that and you're like, this is really fucked up. The example Manu gave was the replicator. The replicator within the context of Star Trek, inside of a starship is essentially a free device to give you limitless food, whatever you want, certain material goods, whatever. And it's essentially like a utopian thing where it's just like, you want it, you got it. There's no, there's not really any need for property ownership of that kind of stuff unless it has sentimental value. Like if you want another iPhone, here are 1,000 iPhones. It has no, other than the materials within it, has essentially no value, other than, of course, the design, which by that time you have technology that's, you could literally tell, in the context of that, you could tell a Starship computer, create an iPhone, and it would do all the engineering, build the thing better than all of Apple, and, many generations later, and in a few milliseconds or a couple seconds, and here's your new perfect highest end iPhone ever. That's, if you could describe it that way. Or you go to Quark's bar, and there, the very same technology was being used to create profit. It's an interesting thing when you think about it. Like if you had a sort of, I think we're at a bit of a fork, in an inflection point as well. But if this technology was in the right hands, then it could essentially steer us toward a utopia. Like essentially all of the really terrible jobs go away. And they don't just go away, but all the people that were doing them before are still able to live richer, healthier, more interesting, more fulfilled lives, doing things that matter to them much more than whatever the fuck they were doing just for money. Or you get a few assholes who own the shit, and they're now slurping up all the money that would have gone to everybody, and now it's all just going to enrich a handful of people. And it becomes like an almost dystopic thing, because anything that those little plebeians are doing, you could suppress. If they want to, I mean, one of the things I try not to talk too much about the things that I think about, but you can use your imagination and think of ways that ubiquitous, cheap automation, especially that is pretty good, could suppress crowds or do all kinds of horrible things, in the wrong hands. So I think this is, I think this is the danger of this. And it's also the hope in some sense. Like if you had the same technology, could be a liberation or it could be a tragedy. And I don't know, the history of the internet may possibly favor the negative, because you look at, I'm more optimistic than that, but you look at the ideal where people were talking about, hypertext, and we'll have all the world's knowledge accessible everywhere by everyone and all this. And then you forget, though, the internet does that, but it also eliminates the need for expert curation. And if you have all the knowledge without any curation, then any asshole who wants to can put out a video on YouTube and talk about whatever the fuck they want to talk about, whether or not they know anything about it. Anyone who wants to can put up websites or have groups or whatever. It's pretty bad, actually. So that was an unexpected thing. And then you sort of think, well, is this a temporary? There is one of the reasons that I'm very marginally hopeful is that when radio first came out, people were very much more swayed by it. When advertising first came out and became a thing, people were much more gullible, and people are less so now. So these things do, in time, sort of resolve themselves, maybe. Although I don't know that that's guaranteed. I think it's something that we actually actively have to work on. And if we don't do it, then it's bad. So, how do we go forward? Where do we go? All that, who knows? I think I am actually going to go back to work because I have a shit ton of stuff to do. I started talking about some other stuff, but just imagine working on stuff that is essentially, like, to me, and I'm not trying to dismiss it as, like, people are paying me to do stuff, I should be okay with it, but it's just, like, not the stuff I want to be working on. Let's just say that. And then you have issues in addition to that, and then it's like just endless frustration, and you feel like your life is so short, so fucking short, and then you're wasting it toiling away on some bullshit that does not really contribute to society. It's so fucking dumb. It's so dumb. With that, serenity now and all of that, just like, my insomnia has been getting progressively worse, I think, too. And I'm just like, it's frustrating. I got a couple days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, was down to like 3 hours. The last couple of nights, I got like 5.5-ish hours, which compared to 3 is a lot, and you start feeling, I still am tired as shit right now, but I feel much more wide awake than I did 2 or 3 days ago when I was like, oh my God, I've been getting like 3-4 hours a night for a while, and you're like, fuck, it's so, like, just fucks up your day, and everything becomes much worse. Every little bit of effort that you have to exert becomes that much harder. everything that that you're trying to do, like you can't focus as well. I mean, it's so I'm not saying it's like mental illness on the same level as many other things, but having your brain not working right in a basic way is so frustrating. And yeah, I just feel like I'm so much less productive and so much less able to roll with things that are not that big of a deal. They start seeming, much more cataclysmic. And it's so much like just, I don't know. I feel like when I was the 3 hour day a couple days ago, I was just like at the end of my fucking rope. And I'm not a very like aggressive, yelly person, but I was just ready to like just fucking leave me alone. I just want to rest, first of all, which I can't do. And then also I just want to work on other things. I don't want to work on this bullshit. I just can't take it anymore. Let me work on this stuff. And the thing that's annoying to me too is, although I will say this, I don't think whatever you're doing has to matter in a big sense. I think if you're happy just playing video games, we're a wealthy civilization. By all means, do that. But if you want to be a poet or an artist or make some kind of like research contribution or do the things that I would do, that I think, if I was working on these things, I think they would actually be good for people besides myself, and like making progress in things. If I was doing that, it just seems like not just for me, but like everyone is better. And I'm not just saying that as a selfish thing. I mean, like almost everyone doing other things probably gives us a much wealthier, richer world. And you think about that, and we're just in this stupid situation where people are wasting their time, which is so finite, and just it's depressing. So with that, thank you very much as always for listening. I can get back to work now. So, say Jim.